one investment alone that we're going to cover now made it a truly exceptional fund and cemented a16z as one of the premier VC firms less than a decade after its founding. And that company was Tiny Speck. Many of you may never heard of Tiny Speck. And if you have heard of Tiny Speck, then you'll know that Slack founder and CEO Stewert Butterfield's decision to pivot from Tiny Speck to Slack is one of the greatest pivots in business history. From a fledgling gaming company to a $28 billion acquisition by Salesforce less than 10 years later. So, yes, much like bourbon turned into Instagram, Tiny Speck turned into Slack. Two of the greatest pivots of all time. Interestingly enough, both investments by a16z. Bizarre coincidence there. So a16z kind of made two investing decisions here, because first they invested in Tiny Speck at the Series A level, but they also invested in Slack after the pivot. So we're going to go a little deep here on both companies. So first, Tiny Speck. Tiny Speck was described as a beautiful infinite game for the purpose of continuing to play rather than the purpose of winning. And so I've studied video games investing quite a bit. I think it's super interesting. I love the Gamecraft podcast with Mitch Lasky and Blake Robbins. If you haven't heard it and are remotely interested in video games or business or both, highly recommend it. But based off what I kind of learned from them, I actually kind of disagree with this concept of a game and a reason to invest in a game like this. Because, as we talked about in the Instagram section, human behavior doesn't really change. And humans love to compete and win. And so if you're building a game like this, it has to be really beautiful and really social. Almost like you're playing inside a movie with friends. Maybe I'm a harsh critic, but if you go to my Substack, you can see I took a screenshot, or I found an image online of a game, and it doesn't look that beautiful. If you do want to see a game built to be a beautiful and social game with no purpose of winning, like Tiny Speck was trying to do with their game Glitch in this instance, then you should look up Journey by That Game Company, which is, yes, the gaming company is called That Gaming Company, and their game Journey, which Benchmark actually invested in, which is really cool. So back to Tiny Speck. They invested in Tiny Speck because Stewert Butterfield, the founder and CEO, was regarded as an exceptional founder and engineer. He had successfully founded and sold Flickr to Yahoo a few years before starting Tiny Speck, and he was able to amass an outstanding team of engineers because he earned the respect of other exceptional builders. But back to a16z, they invested in Tiny Speck because Stewert Butterfield was regarded as an exceptional founder and engineer. Not only did he successfully found and sell Flickr to Yahoo a few years before starting Tiny Speck, but he was also able to amass an outstanding team of engineers to come work with him at Tiny Speck because he had earned the respect of other exceptional builders, which, as current a16z partner Martin Casado says, is a great signal to invest. He once said, quote, "The founder network is just more intuitive and smarter and more prescient than any other network. And by that I mean, if smart founders are going to do something, there's probably something interesting there. I don't care if VCs think it's interesting. I don't care if analysts think it's interesting. And I don't care if Twitter thinks it's interesting. I care if smart founders think it's interesting. I look to see where the founders are going, and if there are a few really smart ones looking at an area, then I get very interested in the area." And so since Stewert was able to recruit such an incredible team and have a reputation in Silicon Valley as an exceptional founder and an exceptional builder, he must be someone to support. So sometimes it's not even the idea or the perception of the founder to the investor that gives the investor conviction. It can be a strong signal from other people within the founder's network who know him or her well, who are also respected founders, and can vouch for him or her as an exceptional founder, an exceptional builder, and one with loads of potential and incredible insights. And so that's, according to Martin Casado, one of the strongest signals a VC can find, which is really interesting and not one I had really thought about before. So Tiny Speck was a16z's first investment, but the second investment was to invest in Slack after Stewert pivoted from Tiny Speck. This a16z could have folded on Slack and sustained their position in the company after investing in the seed, Series A and Series B. They're maintaining a few percentage points of ownerships within Slack. And, if everything goes well, great. They have 2 or 3% of the company, and they don't have to take the risk of continuing to back a company that's now pivoting into something completely different, because this wasn't just, a regular pivot either. This wasn't a bourbon dropping location base to go all in on photo sharing, social network to a different social network. This pivot was from a consumer focused video game to an enterprise focused messaging software. I mean, those products have no similarities whatsoever. So it's tough to assume that, this team that was assembled to build a video game, and the founder who started his company to build a video game, can now completely flip that script and build a enterprise software company for messaging. I mean, there's, again, no similarities. So again, I'd assume A16Z decided to continue to invest in the newly formed Slack because, again, Stewert Butterfield just showed exceptional founder qualities. He was already a successful founder. He made probably around $5 to $15 million personally in the Flickr sale to Yahoo. So he could have just angel invested that money for the rest of his life and have been very comfortable. But he instead decided to get back out there and start a new company. And so VCs love to back repeat founders that do this because they're mature and will likely avoid many stupid mistakes that some first time founders make. But what's also true about repeat founders on the opposite side is that if things aren't going well, they tend to lose motivation quickly and realize that they don't need to grind, day after day for years on something that might not work when they're already successful. They're already a multimillionaire. They don't need this to earn their keep, so that motivation isn't there. If their motivation isn't super mission driven, or they just have that crazy quality of want something huge, then typically second time founders can fold if things aren't going well. But Stewert Butterfield was different. In fact, Tiny Speck wasn't actually going that poorly. It was doing well enough that I'd assume most first-time founders would continue pushing along to eventually succeed in their initial thesis. I mean, it's hard to see something that's doing decent and still be like, no, this isn't it. But Butterfield, since he had experienced product market fit and was a second-time founder, he knew what escape velocity really felt like because he experienced it at Flickr. He knew Tiny Speck was not going to be it. And so that's why his decision to pivot is so exceptional, because it's so unordinary. It's so unordinary, for a few reasons. If you're a first-time founder, typically you keep going on your thesis. Like you started this company for a reason. You believe in it. So even if it's not, really blowing up right now, you probably have a faith that it will in the future. Or if you're a second-time founder and your company's not really doing well, you probably just want to relax for a bit, take a break, give yourself a few years to reset, maybe try again on something new. But Butterfield immediately pivoted, did not shut down. He kept going and was motivated to build something huge. And impressively knew, based on his experiences, that Tiny Speck would not be that huge company. And so I'm sure this enigma of decision making from Stewert Butterfield probably gave A16Z the conviction to invest in Slack, because they already knew Butterfield was special. He had that signal from other founders, other engineers, but his ability to navigate the playing field, the startup playing field, not give up and make a very non-obvious and risky decision to pivot from Tiny Speck to Slack likely appealed to the A16Z partners rather than give them pause. And I think it's because, this quote from A16Z partner Scott Kapoor can kind of help explain, why that seemingly negative move actually gave the A16Z more conviction, rather than being like, this is a completely different pivot like we talked about. Why would we invest in that? We already have some ownership. Let's just invest somewhere else. If it works, we still get money. But no, this was actually a positive signal for the A16Z team. So kind of a long quote, but I think it's really interesting. So try to stick around for it. Scott Kapoor said, quote, "At the early stage, it's much more heavily geared towards entrepreneurs. The reason for that, I think, is that we know that the product's going to change. So oftentimes we're investing at the stage where it's just a couple of people. They might have a PowerPoint, and in some cases they have a product, but it's fairly ill-formed at that point in time. It's certainly not what you would consider product market fit in the sense that we, as the founders, know exactly what the needs are of the industry. So we're more interested in their thinking. We use the term idea maze internally, which is how did you incorporate market feedback to determine that this was the right first product as a way to gauge as the market changes over time? How good will you be at reincorporating that feedback and iterating on the product? On the other hand, obviously people can change, but I think our view is people don't change that much. And so the going and assumptions around how they address problems and how they think about leadership and storytelling is a big piece of this. How can you rally people behind an idea that in some ways may sound crazy and irrational for them to quit their jobs and come work for you? So many of those intangibles are a lot more of what we think about because we think and we hope that that team will be the constant, and what will evolve over time is product thinking and go-to-market thinking. And so a foundational piece of that is, do you have a team that's both thoughtful on those things as well as open-minded enough to respond to what they hear from the market and adjust appropriately? End quote. Sorry for the length. But what's important about this quote is the notion that the A16Z team understands the product will likely change. But that's not a very big deal for them. What's important is how the founder deals with the product change. How strong is their ability to read the market and see the signs that a pivot may be necessary? Will they be able to continue to recruit exceptional people after such a major change? Ultimately, the A16Z team mostly cares that they can trust the founder to know the answer to these questions. If a pivot happens, okay. If they believe this founder can guide a new team through that pivot and still has that exceptional vision to sell the product, then A16Z is still on board. And, Stewert Butterfield certainly answered those questions and addressed those concerns to an incredible degree. So as a result, A16Z continued to double down on Slack after their initial $2 million investment as part of Tiny Speck's Series A round. So A16Z continued to invest in most of the rounds that Slack raised and attained a 13.3% stake at the time of the direct public offering. For those who don't know, IPO, initial public offering, companies that do IPOs raise money, typically from banks, like your Morgan Stanley or your Goldman Sachs. So they'll raise, $400 million, sell 5% of the company, whatever, to that bank when they get listed on the public market. It's another fundraising moment. But a direct public listing is when the company doesn't sell any of their ownership to large banks to put them on the stock exchange. They just list themselves, and then, if they want money, retail investors give them money. So basically, a direct public offering, there's no dilution of ownership. Basically, they're just public now. So A16Z had a 13.3% stake. I hope that made sense at the time of Slack's direct public offering. So based on that, I'm assuming they invested somewhere around $50 million total into the combination of Tiny Speck and Slack. And Slack had an incredibly successful direct public offering, making A16Z's 13.3% stake worth about $3.15 billion, returning about a 53x on their $50 million invested and roughly a 58% IRR. Just a massive ROI on their first fund, a 10x on the whole fund that just cemented a16z as a premier VC firm, a title that it undoubtedly still holds today.